The room laughed when the VP said anyone could replace me. I smiled, handed over the credentials, and walked away. 30 days later, the numbers told a very different story, and suddenly, nobody was laughing anymore. The conference room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and dry erase markers. It was one of those Monday mornings when everyone looked physically present but mentally somewhere else. Laptop screens glowed across the long glass table. Slack notifications flickered. Someone tapped a pen against a notebook. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain dragged gray streaks down the skyline. I sat near the far end of the table, listening. The quarterly operations review had already run 20 minutes over schedule. Charts had been shown. Forecasts had been debated. A few managers had defended missed targets with the enthusiasm of exhausted attorneys. Then the conversation turned toward staffing costs. That was when Victor, the vice president of operations, leaned back in his chair and said the sentence that would change everything. Honestly, I don't understand why we're treating this role like it's irreplaceable. His eyes landed on me. The room became strangely still. Not silent, just alert. Like a forest when something large moves between the trees. Victor folded his hands. Anyone can do your job. A few people glanced down at their laptops. Others stared at me. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I remember noticing that sound because it was somehow louder than the sentence itself. Anyone can do your job. The funny thing was that I wasn't angry. Not immediately. Anger is hot. What I felt was cold, careful, measured. The kind of feeling that arrives when you've spent years building something invisible and suddenly realize nobody understands it exists. Victor continued. We've created unnecessary dependency around one position. He pointed toward a slide projected on the wall. My slide, my department, my systems. The company should never rely on specialized knowledge held by one individual. There it was, the applause line. Several executives nodded. It sounded reasonable, even intelligent. And under normal circumstances, I might have agreed. The problem was that Victor had confused visibility with value, because the most important parts of my job weren't visible at all. A subtle tension moved through the room. I caught Melissa from finance watching me. Her expression was strange, concerned, almost nervous, as if she knew something Victor didn't. Then she quickly looked away. That tiny reaction stayed with me. At the time, I couldn't explain why. But later, I would remember it perfectly. Victor smiled. To prove the point, we're transitioning responsibilities immediately. There it was, not a discussion, a decision, already made. A young employee sitting halfway down the table nearly jumped when Victor called his name. Ethan, 26, smart, ambitious, good technical skills. 3 months with the company. Poor kid looked like someone had just informed him he'd won a prize he never entered to win. Heads turned toward him, then back toward me. Waiting, watching, expecting resistance. An argument, a defense. Instead, I closed my laptop. The click echoed softly across the room. I stood, walked to the cabinet near the wall, retrieved a small notebook, then returned to the table. Nobody moved. Even Victor looked slightly confused. You need access, I asked Ethan. He blinked. Yes, I guess. I nodded. Opened the notebook. Inside were credentials, system maps, emergency contacts, escalation paths, vendor relationships, maintenance schedules, undocumented workarounds, and a dozen other things that officially didn't exist. Things accumulated over 7 years. Things nobody had ever asked about. I slid the notebook across the table. The cover stopped directly in front of Ethan. Here. The room seemed to exhale. Victor smiled, satisfied, victorious. I looked directly at Ethan, not Victor, not the executives, just Ethan, and I meant every word. Good luck. For a second, uncertainty crossed his face. A tiny flicker, gone almost instantly. But it was there. Why? I couldn't tell. Neither could he. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. People filed out. Conversations restarted. Chairs rolled backward. The normal sounds of corporate life returned. Yet something felt different. Like the pressure had changed in the room. As if a storm had quietly altered course. Near the door, Melissa from finance caught up to me. "You're taking this surprisingly well." I smiled. "So are you." She hesitated. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough. Enough to tell me she knew more than she wanted to say. Then she lowered her voice. "Just make sure your phone stays on." I stared at her. What does that mean? She opened her mouth, stopped, shook her head. Nothing. Then she walked away, leaving me alone in the hallway, beneath the cold white lights. Her footsteps faded. The elevator doors opened somewhere in the distance. And for the first time that day, a quiet question settled into my mind. If everyone was so certain anyone could do the job, why did Melissa suddenly look afraid? The next morning felt unnaturally calm, the kind of calm that sometimes settles over a city just before a thunderstorm arrives. I woke up without checking company messages. For the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for monitoring overnight alerts. No emergency dashboards, no early morning calls, no frantic messages from overseas teams discovering some obscure failure before sunrise. Just silence. It should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt strange, like walking through a familiar house and realizing someone had quietly moved all the furniture. I made coffee, sat near the kitchen window, watched rainwater collect on the railing outside. My phone remained face down on the table. No notifications, no requests, nothing. A small part of me found that amusing, because for years people had insisted my role wasn't particularly complex, yet somehow everyone always knew exactly who to call when something went wrong. The thought made me smile. Then I pushed it away. Not my problem anymore, at least officially. Around noon, my phone vibrated. One message, not from Ethan, not from Victor, from Melissa. 3 words. "You hearing anything?" I stared at the screen. That was unusual. Melissa never sent vague messages. Everything about her was precise, measured. Financial people tend to like certainty. I typed back. About what? The response arrived almost immediately. Never mind. Nothing else. No explanation, no context, just silence again. And somehow that silence felt heavier than the message itself. A faint unease settled into my stomach, like hearing an unfamiliar sound somewhere inside your house after midnight. You don't know what it means, but you know it means something. 2 days passed, then 3, then 5. The company remained quiet. No calls, no emergencies, no requests for help. Victor was probably enjoying his victory lap. The board likely believed the transition had gone smoothly. Maybe it had. Maybe I'd overestimated how much hidden complexity existed inside the operation. Maybe everything really was fine. Then Friday arrived, and the first crack appeared. I was at a grocery store comparing 2 brands of coffee when my phone rang. Ethan. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. "Hey." For a moment, he didn't speak. I could hear office noise behind him, voices, keyboards, someone laughing nervously. Then he finally said, "Quick question." The phrase instantly made me grin, because there is no such thing as a quick question in corporate operations, not when someone sounds that tense. "Sure." Another pause. Then, "Do you know why the European fulfillment queue keeps rerouting itself every 6 hours?" I stopped moving. Interesting. Very interesting. "Did you check the regional override?" Silence. A long silence. Too long. Finally, "The what?" There it was, the first missing piece, one tiny thread in a very large web. I closed my eyes. The override wasn't documented, not officially. It existed because 5 years earlier, a vendor had introduced a software update that caused intermittent routing conflicts. The permanent fix would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, so I had built a workaround. Invisible, reliable, forgotten by everyone except me, including, apparently, the people who claimed anyone could do the job. I explained where to find it. Ethan thanked me. The call ended. Simple enough, except it wasn't, because 20 minutes later he called again, and then again that evening, and once more the next morning. Different problems, different systems, different questions, each one revealing another hidden dependency, another undocumented process, another small piece of institutional memory that existed nowhere except experience. None of the issues were catastrophic individually, but together they formed a pattern I recognized immediately. The machine was still running, but it was beginning to shake, and machines rarely start with explosions. They start with vibrations, small ones, easy to ignore, until suddenly they aren't. The following Tuesday, I ran into an old colleague downtown, Jason from Infrastructure. We grabbed coffee, talked about life, avoided work for nearly half an hour. Then he leaned forward. "You've heard, right?" "Heard what?" His eyebrows rose. "You seriously don't know?" My pulse quickened slightly. Jason lowered his voice. 3 project deadlines slipped this week. I said nothing. He continued. Customer response times are climbing. Another pause. And operations missed their first monthly efficiency target in almost 4 years. The coffee suddenly tasted different, bitter, sharper. Jason watched my expression carefully. "You didn't hear any of this?" "No." "Interesting." That word lingered between us. Interesting. Not alarming. Not surprising. Interesting, as if everyone inside the company had started noticing the same thing, but nobody wanted to say it aloud yet. Outside the cafe, clouds drifted across the afternoon sun. The light dimmed, brightened again. Jason stared through the window, then quietly added, "The weird part isn't that things are slipping." I looked at him. The weird part is that nobody can explain why. A chill ran through me, because I knew exactly what that meant. The symptoms were visible, the cause wasn't, and invisible problems are the ones organizations fear most. They spread quietly, hide inside assumptions, grow in places nobody is looking. By the time people finally see them, they're usually much larger than anyone imagined. That evening, I sat alone on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker on, one by one. Cars moved below like streams of liquid gold. Wind carried distant sirens through the darkness. My phone rested beside me, silent. For now. Then, just after 9 p.m., a new message appeared. Not from Ethan, not from Melissa, not from Jason. From a board member whose number I didn't even know I had. The message contained only a single sentence. "Can we talk tomorrow before anyone else knows?" If you've ever watched someone dismiss years of experience with a single sentence, you probably know this feeling. Share your thoughts below. I'd genuinely like to hear what part of the story felt most familiar to you. The message sat on my screen for nearly a minute before I touched it. The city outside had gone dark, except for scattered windows glowing against the night. Somewhere below, a motorcycle accelerated through an intersection. The sound rose, echoed between buildings, and disappeared. I read the sentence again. "Can we talk tomorrow before anyone else knows?" No explanation, no signature, no details, just urgency, the kind that rarely appears without a reason. I typed a simple response. "What is this regarding?" 3 dots appeared immediately, then vanished, returned, vanished again. Whoever was writing seemed unusually careful. Finally, the answer arrived. Phone, not text, 8 a.m. That was all. No greeting, no context, nothing. I looked at the number once more. The board member wasn't someone I knew personally. We'd crossed paths at annual meetings, exchanged handshakes, maybe a few polite conversations. Certainly not enough to justify a secret call. Which meant one thing: this wasn't personal, it was business. And business only becomes secret when someone is worried. Sleep came slowly that night. Not because I was anxious, because I was curious. Curiosity can be more powerful than fear. Fear wants answers. Curiosity hunts them. By morning, the sky over the city looked washed in pale silver. Clouds drifted low over the rooftops. At exactly 8 a.m., my phone rang. I answered, "Good morning." The voice on the other end sounded older than I remembered. Tired, too. Not physically tired, professionally tired. The exhaustion that comes from managing problems nobody else can see yet. "Thanks for taking the call." "No problem." A pause. Then, "I'll get straight to it." The tone changed. Sharper, more deliberate. "We have concerns." There it was. Not problems. Not questions. Concerns. Boardroom language often works like that. People soften words when they're worried about how serious they might actually be. I remained silent. He continued. The latest operational review raised several flags. Flags. Another carefully chosen word. Such as? A long exhale came through the speaker. Then paper shuffled. Reports, notes, data. The decline isn't catastrophic. Yet, the unspoken word hung there. However, he continued, certain trends are becoming difficult to explain. I leaned back, listening. Outside my window, rain tapped softly against the glass. The departments are still functioning. Okay, but they're becoming slower. I said nothing. The delays don't follow any predictable pattern. Interesting. Teams are reporting confusion around procedures. More interesting. Managers are escalating routine decisions. I stared out at the gray skyline, because I knew exactly what that looked like from the inside. Not collapse, dependency withdrawal. Organizations become accustomed to invisible support systems. When those systems disappear, people initially compensate. They work harder, communicate more, cover gaps. For a while, everything appears normal. Then efficiency begins leaking through 1,000 microscopic cracks. Nobody notices each individual drop, only the puddle forming underneath. The board member spoke again. What exactly did you do? I almost laughed, not because the question was funny, because it was impossible. How do you explain 7 years of accumulated knowledge? 7 years of solving emergencies nobody remembers. 7 years of creating shortcuts, relationships, safeguards, workarounds, habits, instincts. Most expertise doesn't live in documents. It lives in judgment. And judgment is difficult to transfer. I did my job. Silence. Not hostile, thoughtful. Then, I was afraid you'd say that. The conversation lasted another 20 minutes. Careful questions, careful answers. Nobody directly mentioned Victor. Nobody directly mentioned blame. Yet his presence hovered over the entire discussion like a shadow behind frosted glass. Visible without being seen. Eventually the call ended, but just before hanging up, the board member said something unexpected. Something that stayed with me all day. We're reviewing internal communications. My grip tightened slightly on the phone. Why? Another pause. Then, because the numbers aren't matching the explanations. The line went dead. For several seconds, I simply sat there, listening to the rain, reviewing internal communications. That wasn't routine. Boards don't start reading internal discussions unless trust is beginning to erode. And once trust becomes a question, every answer gets examined differently. Around lunchtime, Ethan called again. This time, he sounded exhausted, not overwhelmed. Beyond that, drained, like someone carrying a weight they didn't know how to put down. Can I ask you something? Sure. A pause, then, why didn't you warn me? The question caught me off guard. I stood and walked toward the window. Warn you about what? His laugh contained no humor. All of it. I said nothing. He continued. They told me this position was mostly coordination. Outside, rainwater streamed down the glass. They said the systems were stable. Another pause. They said everything was documented. There was genuine frustration in his voice now, not directed at me, directed at reality, a reality that looked very different from the one he'd been promised. Finally, I answered. Would you have believed me if I'd disagreed during that meeting? Silence. Long silence. Then a quiet, no. Exactly. Some lessons refuse to arrive through explanation. They insist on experience. The call ended shortly afterward, but something about Ethan's tone bothered me. Not the exhaustion, not the frustration. Something else. A subtle shift, as though he had discovered a piece of information he wasn't ready to discuss yet. And that feeling grew stronger later that afternoon, because at 4:37 p.m., Melissa sent another message. Unlike the others, this one wasn't vague. It contained only 6 words. They've started deleting old emails. I stared at the screen. Once, twice, 3 times. Then I immediately called her. No answer. Called again, straight to voicemail. A cold sensation settled in my chest. Not panic. Recognition. Because deleting emails isn't what organizations do when they're solving a problem. It's what people do when they're worried about a record of how the problem began. And suddenly, the board member's warning echoed in my head. The numbers aren't matching the explanations. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city. Low, distant, growing closer. My phone remained silent, but for the first time since leaving the company, I had the unmistakable feeling that the real story had only just begun. The storm arrived just after midnight. Rain hammered against the windows in relentless waves, turning the city outside into a blur of distorted lights and shifting shadows. Wind pushed through the streets with a low howl, rattling signs and bending trees beneath the glow of street lamps. I couldn't sleep. Not after Melissa's message, not after the board member's warning, and certainly not after her sudden silence. The clock on the microwave read 12:43 a.m. when my phone vibrated. A new message from Melissa, only this time it wasn't 6 words. It was a screenshot. No explanation, no greeting, just an image. I opened it. For several seconds, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then, my stomach tightened. The screenshot showed part of an internal email thread, one that clearly wasn't intended for me. Most of the names were cropped, several sections had been cut off. But one sentence remained fully visible. The transition must appear successful during the first reporting cycle. I read it again. Slowly. The transition must appear successful. Appear. Not be successful. Appear successful. A subtle difference. A dangerous one. The kind of wording people use when outcomes matter less than narratives. Thunder rolled outside again. Closer this time. I enlarged the image. Another fragment became visible near the bottom. Not enough for certainty, but enough to raise questions. There were references to delayed reporting, adjusted review windows, temporary operational exceptions, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, yet together they created an uncomfortable picture. As though someone had been trying very hard to prevent certain metrics from becoming visible too quickly. My phone rang before I could study it further. Melissa. I answered immediately. Where did you get this? Her voice sounded tense. Much tenser than before. I shouldn't have sent it. Melissa, I know. Rain crackled against her side of the line. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she lowered her voice. They're looking for leaks. Every word landed heavily, carefully, measured. Not the way people speak when they're speculating, the way they speak when they're certain. I walked toward the living room window. What happened? A long silence followed. So long, I thought the call had dropped. Then, People are getting nervous. That wasn't an answer, and we both knew it. What happened? I repeated. Another pause. Finally, she exhaled. The board started asking questions. There it was, the beginning. The reports don't match the operational feedback anymore. Outside, lightning flashed beyond the skyline. For a brief moment, the clouds glowed silver. Then darkness returned. Melissa continued. Managers are giving different explanations. Different how? No one agrees on what's causing the decline. That made sense, because the people experiencing the problems weren't necessarily the people explaining them. And when leadership loses a shared explanation, uncertainty spreads quickly. Especially among executives, especially among boards, especially when money is involved. A faint sound interrupted the call. A door closing, voices somewhere near her. Melissa immediately lowered her volume. Too late. I had heard it. She wasn't home. She was still in the office. At nearly 1 a.m. Interesting. Very interesting. Melissa? No answer. Why are you still there? Why? Another silence. Then, you should stop asking questions. The statement arrived so suddenly that I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was revealing. People don't say that when there are no answers. They say it when there are too many. Before I could respond, the line disconnected. Just ended. No goodbye. No explanation. Nothing. I stared at the dark screen. The storm continued outside, and for the first time, concern began replacing curiosity. Because Melissa wasn't frightened by declining productivity. She wasn't frightened by board reviews. She wasn't frightened by internal politics. She was frightened by something else. Something she still hadn't said. The next morning brought another surprise. At 7:12 a.m., Ethan called. His voice sounded different. Not exhausted, not frustrated, alarmed. The change was immediate, impossible to miss. Do you have a minute? Of course. A pause. Then, I found something. My attention sharpened instantly. What? Silence. A long one. Long enough to hear him breathing. Long enough to know he was deciding whether to continue. Finally, I don't think I was supposed to. The air seemed to grow heavier. Outside, rainwater dripped from rooftops beneath a pale morning sky. What did you find? Another pause. Then, can we meet somewhere? That answer told me everything. People don't request face-to-face conversations because of routine operational issues. They do it when they don't trust phones, or email, or records. I walked into the kitchen, set my coffee cup down, carefully, slowly. What's going on, Ethan? His response came almost as a whisper. I think Victor knew. Every sound in the room disappeared. The refrigerator, the rain, the distant traffic, everything. For a moment there was only silence. Pure silence. Then I asked the obvious question. Knew what? But Ethan didn't answer, not immediately. Instead, I heard him take a slow breath, the kind people take before stepping onto unstable ground. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something I'd never heard from him before. Fear. Real fear. Not over the phone. The call ended seconds later, leaving me standing alone in my kitchen with a cold cup of coffee and a growing sense that the situation had moved far beyond a simple workplace mistake. Somewhere inside the company, pieces were shifting. Quietly, rapidly. And whatever Ethan had discovered was important enough to make him afraid to say it aloud. The only question now was whether we were already too late. The cafe Ethan chose sat 3 blocks away from the financial district. Small, quiet, forgettable. Exactly the kind of place people pick when they don't want to be noticed. Rain still lingered in the air from the previous night's storm. Water dripped from awnings. Cars rolled through wet streets, leaving silver reflections stretched across the pavement like liquid mirrors. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. The cafe smelled of fresh bread and roasted coffee beans. Soft jazz played somewhere overhead. A few customers sat scattered among the tables, absorbed in laptops and newspapers. Nothing unusual, at least on the surface. Ethan arrived 8 minutes later. The moment he walked through the door, I knew something had changed. He looked exhausted, not from lack of sleep, from stress, the kind that settles behind the eyes, the kind that follows you home. He spotted me immediately and crossed the room. No smile, no small talk, no pleasantries, just tension, pure and visible. He sat down, looked over his shoulder, then leaned forward. I don't have much time. That was not how this conversation was supposed to start. What happened? Ethan rubbed both hands together, a nervous habit I hadn't noticed before. You remember the notebook? I nodded. The one I gave you. Yeah. His eyes shifted toward the window, then back to me. I started using it as a reference. Still normal. Still expected. But eventually I realized something. A waitress approached, asked if we wanted coffee. Neither of us answered immediately. She left awkwardly. The interruption only made the silence heavier. Finally, Ethan continued. The notebook explained everything. I frowned. That was the idea. No. His voice dropped. It explained too much. I stared at him. Outside, sunlight briefly broke through the clouds. The reflection flashed across the cafe windows before disappearing again. Ethan swallowed. Then continued. The more I compared the notebook to our official documentation. He stopped. His jaw tightened. The more gaps I found. A chill moved through me. Not because gaps existed. I already knew they did. But because Ethan sounded disturbed by something deeper, something beyond incomplete records. What kind of gaps? He reached into his bag, removed several folded sheets of paper, set them on the table. My pulse immediately quickened. Internal reports. System reviews. Transition summaries. I recognized the formatting instantly. Ethan tapped one page. These were used during the executive review. I glanced down, then froze, because I recognized the report, or rather, I recognized what was missing from it. Several operational dependencies had been omitted entirely, not summarized, not simplified, removed, gone, as though they never existed. I slowly looked back up. Ethan was watching my face, waiting, measuring my reaction. You see it? It wasn't a question. I nodded. Where did you get these? Archive access. Authorized? A humorless laugh escaped him. That's complicated. The answer told me enough. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The cafe noise faded into the background. Coffee machines, conversations, dishes clinking together. All of it felt distant, because a very uncomfortable possibility had begun forming. Not proof, not certainty. A possibility, and possibilities can be dangerous, especially when they explain too much. Ethan leaned forward again. There are multiple versions. My stomach tightened. What? Of the transition reports. The words landed heavily, one after another, controlled, precise. There are draft versions. He pointed at the papers. And final versions. My eyes moved across the documents, dates, revisions, approvals, comments, small differences, subtle differences, but meaningful ones. The sort of changes most people would never notice, unless they knew exactly what had been removed. And why it mattered. Outside, a police siren drifted through the street before fading into the distance. Neither of us moved. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing since the board member's phone call. Who approved the revisions? Ethan looked down, not at the papers, not at his hands. Down, the way people do when they already know the answer, when they're deciding whether to say it. Seconds passed. Then he quietly spoke. Victor? The name hung between us. Heavy as stone. Not because it proved anything. It didn't. Not yet. but because it connected pieces that previously seemed unrelated. The rushed transition, the altered reporting, the hidden dependencies, the board's confusion, Melissa's fear, the deleted emails, all orbiting the same center, Victor. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan said something that changed the entire shape of the story, something neither of us had expected when this began. The board isn't investigating the productivity drop anymore. I stared at him. What are they investigating? His expression hardened. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to disbelief, as though he still couldn't fully accept what he'd discovered. When he finally answered, his voice barely rose above a whisper. They're investigating whether the productivity drop was hidden on purpose. The words settled over the table like falling ash, slowly, silently, irreversibly. Outside, the clouds parted for the first time all week. Sunlight spilled across the wet streets, bright, sharp, unforgiving. And for the first time since that meeting in the conference room, I understood something important. This had stopped being a story about whether anyone could do my job. Now it was a story about why someone had needed everyone to believe they could. And somewhere inside that answer was the reason so many people suddenly looked afraid.